All right, Definers, welcome back to another episode of Sustainability Defined, where Scott and I are here defining sustainability, one topic and one bad joke at a time. This is episode 80 on carbon removal, a juicy topic that I know we are both so pumped to dive into, Scott. So let's get this train rolling. What does the outline look like today?
All right, well, let's start with the basics. What is carbon removal? Why is carbon removal critical to acting on climate change? What are the different ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere? What are the challenges with carbon removal? What policies are in place or could be enacted to regulate or support carbon removal? Who are the leading organizations in carbon removal? How can definers/listeners engage on this topic? And last, our expert guest, Ben Rubin, Executive Director and Co-founder, Carbon Business Council. Okay, Jay, what is carbon removal?
So, the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University's School of International Service defines carbon removal as the process of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locking it away, hopefully for long periods of time. You may have also heard this called carbon sequestration, the process of capturing and storing atmospheric carbon dioxide. As we are sure that you, listener, know, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that is a major contributor to climate change as it traps heat within our atmosphere, causing global temperatures to rise. Carbon removal is different from carbon mitigation, isn't that right?
It is, but Jay, I just want to note, I love how it says hopefully for long periods of time.
Right.
We're not sure. So, yes, carbon mitigation, different thing. That is employing strategies that reduce or avoid future emissions that would otherwise be emitted, like switching fuel sources from fossil-based to more renewables or improving energy efficiency. In contrast, carbon removal is the process of removing the CO2 that has already been emitted into the atmosphere. All right, so next section here, why is carbon removal critical to acting on climate change?
Well, removing carbon from the atmosphere can help us to slow, reduce, or potentially reverse the negative effects of climate change. Recent climate change research has shown that even years after the Paris Agreement pledged to minimize global temperature rise by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we have not made progress at the scale that is needed to meet the ambitious targets set. In fact, recent findings from the United Nations found that current greenhouse gas concentrations are at the highest levels we've seen in 2 million years. This means that the Earth is already over 1 degree Celsius warmer than it was in the 1800s.
Right, and further, although we understand through climate science that limiting climate change is one of the most critical issues of our time, on our current path, we're likely to exceed 1.5 degrees within the next few decades. We can only prevent the worst of potential climate impacts through very ambitious emission cuts, which unfortunately we're just not on track for with our current global trajectory. Under a high emission scenario, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, found in 2021 that the world could warm by 4.4 degrees Celsius by 2100. That's the high emission scenario, but that still is a scenario. This would lead to devastating results for the planet as we know it.
Additional 2022 research from the IPCC found that carbon removal is now, quote, essential to limit global temperature rise. With the current decarbonization pathways not being ambitious enough, we will need a combination of other methods to limit dangerous increases in temperatures. Many of the current climate studies show that carbon removal strategies will be needed to reach net zero, i.e. complete negation of the amount of greenhouse gases produced, with the same amount or more being removed. This is because it could be impossible to reach net zero solely through emissions cuts, especially in the future after many of the easier decarbonization tactics have been exhausted. However, the amount of carbon removal needed will ultimately depend on the amount of greenhouse gas reductions we can achieve globally in the next few years and how close we are to the Paris Agreement targets.
And Jay, just like dumbing this down a little bit, that was a long way of saying, no matter the scenario, if you're really trying to get to 1.5, even 2 degrees, carbon removal needs to be there. Mm-hmm. And that's why we're talking about it today.
Yeah.
You just need it. And so that's why we're diving into how can you do it and all this stuff. And under one IPCC scenario, we would need to remove 5 billion tons of carbon annually by 2050 and 17 billion tons a year by 2100 to stay in a below 1.5 degree scenario globally. Now, there's other estimates that show you need about 6 to 10 billion tons of CO2 removal annually by 2050 for Paris Agreement aligned net zero. So that was a lot of billion-ton numbers thrown at you. Maybe if you just want to be the most conservative about what we need, 5 billion tons a year. So keep that in mind as we talk about some of the numbers around how much carbon removal is occurring today and could occur in the future.
Excellent. So it's anticipated that carbon removals will play a likely role in achieving global commitments, and the practice has the potential to become a go-to strategy for businesses, especially for businesses in hard-to-abate industries like production of steel, cement, and petrochemicals. These high-emission sectors account for around 30% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions and may not have as many options to mitigate, i.e. reduce or avoid, their carbon emissions.
So it's important to remember that there is no silver bullet to reducing the effects of climate change. Removing carbon is not the only way we'll solve the climate crisis. These solutions would be used hand in hand with multiple strategies to also reduce emissions for the long term. So you need both the carbon removal and the emission cuts.
ClearPath, a strategic nonprofit focused on developing and advancing policies that reduce and remove emissions globally, uses the analogy that climate change can be thought of as a diet. So, when trying to live a healthier lifestyle, you typically start with eating healthier foods to prevent gaining weight. Think of this as carbon mitigation. You're effectively mitigating the calories before they turn into weight gain. Alternatively, you could just keep your diet the same and only go to the gym to work off any extra calories and the fat you've accumulated along the way. That would be removal. However, if you really want to make a positive impact on your lifestyle, then you need both a healthy diet and exercise to make the greatest impact and maintain your progress. Similarly, if we want to make progress to meet environmental targets and reduce the impacts of climate change, we will need both carbon mitigation and carbon removal, aka diet and exercise, Scott.
So we need to find a diet that actually works and that we can stick with. Yeah. And where's the fad diet that promises to remove all of our carbon very quickly?
Bingo. And Scott, I was going to ask you what your favorite exercise might be in this scenario, whether that's like a Zumba or like a jazzercise kind of thing.
Yeah, what would be the Zumba of carbon removal?
Yeah.
Oh, man, dancing and exercise. I don't know.
We can circle back.
We can circle back. Once we get through the nature-based and technology solutions, we'll keep that in mind as one of those that we talk about, we'll have to identify as the Zumba.
Excellent.
All right, so what are the different ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere? We're already here. So let's keep Zumba in mind. Here we go. The December 2023 report from McKinsey Sustainability, titled Carbon Removals, How to Scale a New Gigaton Industry, notes that there are two main categories of carbon removal. One is natural or nature-based solutions, and two is technology-based or engineered solutions. All right, so nature-based solutions, that first one, they use natural processes in the natural environment to capture and store CO2. Through this, carbon is removed by restoring or enhancing natural processes or through positive, active management of ecosystems. Often this means that carbon is stored into naturally occurring things like trees or within wetlands and coastal ecosystems.
On the other hand, technology-based carbon removal methods use advanced technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere. These methods could include direct air capture and storage, creation of carbon-negative products, and creation of bio-oil and biochar.
All right, so the McKinsey report states that there are 10 common carbon removal solutions on the market today. We're not going to go to all 10. We'll hyperlink to the report so you can check them all out. But let's talk about a couple of them, Jay.
Okay, so let's talk nature-based first, Scott, specifically forests. Overall, global forests account for the majority of carbon removal at about 8.8 billion tons of CO2. So this next nature-based solution, reforestation and afforestation, is an important one. This is the practice of planting trees in areas that have been deforested or damaged and preserving trees in areas that have never been forested. This practice can increase biodiversity and ecosystem resilience. Now, as we know, forests and trees do a great job of mitigating air pollution and helping to reduce the effects of climate change. In fact, one mature tree can absorb around 22 kilograms or nearly 49 pounds of CO2 each year during photosynthesis, which means that in a 40-year span, one tree can store a ton of carbon.
I love it. Gotta love trees. Okay. But we also love oceans. And they're involved here too. So we've got blue carbon management. Some of you maybe not so familiar with this. Blue carbon is the term for carbon captured by the world's oceans and coastal ecosystems. Blue carbon management is the process of enhancing carbon uptake and storage in oceans and other coastal ecosystems. And to do this, marine and coastal ecosystems are conserved, improved, and restored, which enhances coastal resiliency, making them more efficient at capturing and storing CO2.
So that was a couple nature-based solutions. Let's talk technology-based solutions. So building off blue carbon, let's discuss ocean alkalinity enhancement. This is the process of adding alkaline substances to the ocean to improve the ocean's natural ability to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Through this process, substances such as lime or crushed rocks are added to oceans, making it more alkaline rather than acidic. When oceans are more alkaline, they can more easily convert the dissolved CO2 in seawater into more stable forms of carbon, biocarbonates and carbonates. These forms of carbon can be stored for thousands of years.
Hopefully, right, Jay? Hopefully stored.
So enhancing ocean alkalinity helps to accelerate a naturally occurring process and helps to rebalance ocean acidification.
Okay, this next one kind of blew my mind a little bit. I did not know this. It involves rocks. So, Jay, did you know that rocks actually help draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere?
Definitely not.
No, because you think trees. I did know about the blue carbon stuff, did not know about the rocks. So,
same.
As rocks are worn away, they release elements like calcium and magnesium. And these elements mix with the CO2 in the air to form new rocks, like limestone, also called calcium carbonate. The CO2 from the air is what is actually used to create new rocks that store atmospheric carbon dioxide. While this process occurs naturally as certain minerals react with CO2 in the atmosphere, this process normally takes hundreds or thousands of years. So the next technological carbon removal process we want to tell you about is enhanced weathering, or some people call it carbon mineralization. It's the process of preemptively breaking down rocks and minerals to increase their surface area to make the rocks combine with the carbon more quickly. Enhanced weathering speeds up the natural processes by enhancing their exposure to carbon dioxide and can improve the storage of carbon from the atmosphere. So, Jay, I think all this talk here of how enhanced weathering means that the rocks more quickly combine with the carbon, this has to be the Zumba of carbon removal techniques.
And as we know, Scott, Zumba rocks.
Oh, nice. Indeed.
Okay. And lastly, the strategy that seems to get the most attention, direct air capture and storage. It's a technological-based solution where, similar to ocean capture, CO2 is taken directly from the air. In this process, air passes through special filters that collect carbon dioxide from the air. The carbon captured from the filters is then stored, often underground, to prevent them from going back into the atmosphere. This process often involves the use of large fans and chemical solvents and works like a large air purifier. The world's first and largest direct air capture plant is located in Iceland and became operational in September 2021. The site, named Orca, is owned and operated by Climeworks, a company focused on carbon removal solutions like direct air capture and storage. The site has the ability to capture 4,000 tons of CO2 annually. The company is on a journey to remove billions of tons of carbon dioxide by 2100 and hopes to scale these solutions to larger capacities. Now, you may also recall us earlier mentioning needing to remove billions of tons of CO2 per year by 2050 to meet the 1.5 degree scenario. So strategies like this are very important.
Yeah, but also, like you said, it can only do 4,000 right now, and we need billions. So, yeah, we got some ways to go.
Absolutely.
And the large fans, it's like, I wonder if you probably shouldn't go near them, but if you needed to cool down and you didn't know what it was, you'd be like, I'm just going to go over here by this fan. And you don't even know that you're interacting with a thing that's removing carbon.
I want to know, Scott, if Climeworks debated, instead of naming this Orca, if they debated Free Willy, if even for a minute.
Oh, man, I can see the commercial now.
All right, Scott, let's move on. Let's ask, what are the challenges with carbon removal?
Okay, so there's many challenges to carbon removal. And there's a lot of ongoing debate within the scientific community on whether carbon removal is even a viable climate solution. And carbon capture and removal technologies, hot topic of debate at COP28 in December of 2023. And there's some skepticism within the scientific and environmental community around carbon removal. And others are like, yeah, I hear your skepticism, but at the same time, look at all these 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios. They all involve carbon removal. We can't rule this out. All right, so let's talk about these challenges, Jay. They include scalability, potential negative environmental impacts, cost, and also the monitoring, reporting, and verification of impact of these solutions.
Okay, let's dive deeper into the scalability challenge. According to the International Energy Agency, there are only 40 large-scale carbon capture projects in operation globally. These operations are capturing and storing around 45 million metric tons of CO2 annually. Now, Scott, back to your scale point just a minute ago, this equates to roughly 0.1% of the over 36 billion metric tons of CO2 emitted across the globe each year. So, it's safe to say that there is a lot more work needed to be done here to scale to levels that can make a meaningful impact toward reaching global net zero emissions.
Yeah, and beyond technology capabilities inhibiting scale, there's also the high cost of all this. For example, it's estimated that direct air capture systems cost between $125 to $335 per metric ton of carbon for a large-scale plant. These high costs, they make them unsustainable for developing economies and difficult to scale without significant investment.
Current estimates show that a carbon removal industry that could deliver gigaton level, i.e. 1 billion metric tons of removals could be worth almost $1.2 trillion by 2050. However, to reach this scale, the growing industry would need support from investors, buyers, and others through long-term investments. So the McKinsey analysis suggests that to get to net zero in 2050, investments of $6 trillion to $16 trillion will be needed. These investments require action now if they want to be scaled by 2050.
And many carbon removal developers have voiced that they need a carbon price, like a tax break or a trading program, to make carbon removal projects viable and profitable. In the United States, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 provided updated tax credits for the use of carbon capture and storage. Through this new tax credit, for every ton of CO2 that is captured and permanently stored, $50 to $180 of tax credits can be available for companies deploying these technologies. The amount of tax credits available per ton depends on the method of capture and storage. And the goal of this tax incentive is to make carbon removal solutions like direct air capture and carbon capture on industrial facilities more of an economical solution. If you got intrigued by this whole carbon pricing thing, we covered that. Check out episode 61.
We've got you covered. All right. Further, there are diverging opinions within the scientific and environmental community around carbon removal's environmental impact. There are concerns that technological approaches like direct air capture, or DAC, could compete with land use or water use, and they're also very energy intensive. A 2018 collaborative study from global universities on the costs and side effects of negative carbon emissions found that a DAC plant that could capture 1 million tons of CO2 can take up over 400,000 square feet of land space, while also consuming large amounts of water and electricity.
And Jay, I'll just add, that was for 1 million tons of CO2. And like we were saying, we need billions. So,
Right.
Man, that's a lot of land, water, and electricity.
I wonder if we're like nearing the point of like country-sized amounts of land. Have to imagine.
Totally.
Now, some estimates show that nearly 50 tons of water could be used in some DAC systems for each ton of CO2 captured. So, Scott, again, these high water, energy, and land costs add to the overall costs of these systems.
Right. And this could be detrimental to areas that are facing water scarcity. If resources are going to new technologies or land is being used to plant trees rather than food, communities could suffer from a lack of resources. And as we know, there are many communities that are disproportionately affected by environmental harms, which could lead to environmental justice issues.
In addition, while natural-based solutions are mostly viewed positively, some say that the reliance on technologies allows for the continued use and production of fossil fuels. These groups believe that carbon capture has been overpromised as a climate change solution, so that high emissions industries can continue their emissions while capturing them later. Some environmental advocates view carbon capture technologies as a distraction to traditional emissions reduction strategies, which they think should take precedent.
All right, so lastly, there's a lack of monitoring, reporting, and verification on the effectiveness and levels of carbon removal. Having a process to measure the emissions removed and certify that these removals are real, additional, verifiable, and permanent is important. Often a third party needs to accredit and certify that the removal methods have been completed correctly. If there's a lack of certification and monitoring of carbon removals, there's a risk that the removals that are being done are of poor quality and do not result in real permanent emissions reductions. Ultimately, this skews the numbers and creates a lack of confidence in the market, which could slow global efforts in this area.
So, to improve in this area, coordination is needed between solutions developments, researchers, and policymakers to ensure that projects are producing results as intended. So, Scott, I now ask you, what policies are in place or could be enacted to regulate or support carbon removal?
All right, so one way to mitigate some of the challenges of the carbon removal is through policy, so that's why we're talking about it. And as mentioned, many developers have called for these tax breaks, carbon trading schemes, or carbon tax as methods to make carbon removal a more profitable industry. Many existing policies around carbon markets, tax incentives, and additional funds for research and development can be leveraged to support this fast-growing segment.
The Inflation Reduction Act, as we mentioned, was an example of increasing tax incentives to support carbon removal industries. Through this, the U.S. Department of Energy announced its plans to provide $1.2 billion to develop regional direct air capture hubs projects in an effort to help deploy and scale these technologies.
And of course, California's here. They've got something on this too. So the 2022 California Scoping Plan for Achieving Carbon Neutrality, it details the plans for the state of California to achieve their greenhouse gas emissions reduction target and achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. Unsurprisingly, a portion of this plan details that we're going to need these natural and technological approaches to carbon removal if we're going to reach this target. This makes it the only U.S. state that has set a specific target for scaling up carbon removal.
Hopefully others follow suit.
Yeah.
Additional legislation like SB 905, which was signed into law in California in 2022, is helping to set a regulatory foundation for carbon removal, capture, utilization, and storage, while also making sure that these activities do not take away from traditional emissions reductions. This could potentially serve as a model for others looking to establish regulatory frameworks on the state or national level.
Right. And we've got some international stuff here now too, because we want to look towards the future. And there's likely going to be some additional policies around carbon removal that will be needed, like direct regulation, establishment of certification and verification schemes, because we told you how important that sort of certainty is, and then rules or frameworks around international issues related to carbon removal. So in the EU, there is proposed legislation around a carbon removal certification. And through this proposed framework, a voluntary EU-wide framework would be established to certify that carbon removals and their process for verification would be validated. This could eliminate potential greenwashing and create a baseline for high-quality, impactful carbon removal projects. Jay, I don't know why carbon removal is hard for me to say. Do you hear me? Like, it doesn't strike you as a tongue twister, and yet it is. But you can handle it because you're just so good.
Oh boy, now watch me screw this up. Okay. In the U.S., moving back home, the Carbon Dioxide Removal, Research, and Development Act of 2023 was also proposed in Congress. If passed, this legislation would support research, development, and funding for carbon removal projects across the U.S. Carbon removal, I think I got it.
Yeah.
It would allow for additional research on the environmental and social impacts of the various carbon removal solutions.
All right, so both of these bills in the EU and the U.S., they're under consideration, and they could be important ones to follow in the coming years as the market continues to evolve rapidly. All right, so some of you might be wondering, okay, I see that there's policies we need to pursue. I see that there's issues with this technology or these nature-based solutions that we need to grapple with. So who's leading the charge? And so, Jay, let's get into that.
So fortunately, Scott, there are many organizations, startups, and industry groups working towards the creation and scaling of carbon removal. The research blog Start Us Insights detailed a highlight list of 20 startups to watch that are working towards carbon capture, utilization, and storage. This highlight list is from the 630 startups they analyzed in the carbon removal space. So while we definitely can't mention them all, some of the big names in this space include Climeworks, which we mentioned earlier, Acker Carbon Capture, and Carb Fix. Now, Scott, when it comes to Carb Fix, I will say I thought that diet analogy you shared earlier was so good that when I first saw this, I was like, so how is a company that's going to help me eat less carbs fitting into carbon removal? And then it clicked.
Yeah.
So, maybe there's like an offshoot of like a sub business they can launch at some point that maybe starts that next fad diet we're looking for.
I'm surprised that name was even available.
Right. How has a diet company not grabbed that already?
An example on the academic side is one we mentioned when we defined the term way back at the beginning, American University's Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. Its mission is to build ways of doing carbon removal that are responsible, democratic, just, and equitable. All right, Jay, how can definers engage on this topic?
Carbon Removed, an impact startup with a mission to reverse climate change, provides, Scott, a few ways that the average person can help. So why don't you start us off?
Okay, so this one we mentioned quite a bit is something you can do, and it's voting. So voting for carbon removal and more sustainable policies, because as we discussed, these policy changes and significant investments, they're going to be needed to scale and fund carbon removal. Supporting governmental leaders at all levels with strong pro-climate stances can help make these policy changes easier. You can also support and join local NGO groups that are dedicated to advancing these policies and can help influence policymaking on a larger scale. So staying informed and advocating for continued research will be helpful in making solutions more mainstream.
Next, we can continue to reduce our own emissions. Reducing our individual contribution to climate change can make a difference, especially if we all take part. Choosing mass transit, eating a plant-based diet, and being more energy efficient in our own lives can reduce the reliance on carbon removal as a solution by focusing on reducing emissions before they end up in our atmosphere.
And third, we can participate in community projects and initiatives. There is no carbon removal action that is too small. Community and grassroots movements play a role in making a change. Volunteering with local community tree planting events, community gardens, and supporting more sustainable agriculture in your local community are small, but still meaningful activities to increase carbon removal.
And lastly, Carbon Removed suggests working in climate and climate tech fields. The more people working in climate industries, the faster solutions can be invented and scaled. Even if a career change is not in your future, you can support climate-based innovations and startups by investing in and sharing their work to spread awareness and increase education.
I thought it was cool, Jay, when you mentioned the more than 600 startups. Like, for those looking for jobs, I mean, that's something.
Totally. Fantastic resource to start. Okay, so Scott, speaking of increasing education, why don't you help introduce us to our expert guest?
Yes, Ben Rubin. He's the co-founder and executive director of the Carbon Business Council, which is a nonprofit trade association representing more than 100 carbon management companies working together to responsibly restore the climate and make a gigaton scale climate impact.
Ben has been advancing climate action throughout his career, leading initiatives for companies, accelerators, governments, and nonprofits. His work has galvanized billions of dollars in climate infrastructure funding, passed legislation, and reached hundreds of millions of people through media campaigns.
All right, let's do it.
Off we go. All right, Definers, we are excited to have made it to our interview portion of our episode on carbon removal. We are thrilled to be joined by Ben Rubin, the executive director of the Carbon Business Council. So Ben, first, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jay and Scott, for having me on. Looking forward to being here.
All right. So Ben, I got excited right off the bat because I also got my bachelor's degree in urban planning. So I'm sure that can be a whole separate conversation between us. But to keep it within the tracks for this episode, could you start by giving us a little bit of background on how you became interested in the environmental space, and then what ultimately sparked your interest in carbon and then carbon removal?
Earlier in my career, I was working in the California governor's office. I served as an appointee, and part of the work there was thinking about the environment and the climate as California grows to 50 million people. And we were thinking through from an urban planning perspective, what kind of policies could be put in place at the state level that would help incentivize and encourage eco-friendly growth within the state. That was a foray into climate for me. I've had the opportunity to work on climate throughout my career. I've worked in the resiliency space, in the emissions reduction space. In 2018, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with a report saying that another pillar of climate action was emerging, that because of a delay in reducing emissions, removing existing ambient CO2 from the atmosphere was now an important pillar of climate action. And that spurred me to dive more deeply into the carbon removal space. I think for everyone working in climate change in this decade, or for folks who are aspiring to work in climate change, it really is a defining decade to work on trying to get in front of the climate tipping points that the world faces. And so all these different pillars of climate action, whether folks are working on reducing emissions, removing them, preparing for climate, all just really critical parts of climate to be working on.
So it sounds like you're saying carbon removal, not a silver bullet, but a key pillar.
Yes, I view carbon removal as a pillar alongside reducing emissions and preparing for the impacts of climate change. What I think happened in 2018 when the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change came out with that report is it really put removals on the map as distinct and separate from reducing emissions, that it's a both and not an either.
Got it. And that's your focus now as executive director of the Carbon Business Council, domain expert at Carbon 13. So at a high level, what do you do at Carbon Business Council and these accelerators you're involved with? And tell us a little bit more about the programs and projects you're working on.
So the Carbon Business Council is a coalition of more than 100 companies that are working in this world of carbon removal, focusing on tackling the ambient carbon removal that is in the atmosphere and working to get it down. And in line with that science, in line with the IPCC, that we have to remove gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere. I'm a co-founder and executive director of the Carbon Business Council, and we have a focus on innovators. Many of our companies are startups. That also brings me into serving as a domain expert for accelerator programs like Carbon 13 and Brink. I think innovators in the space are going to be really essential to have some of the breakthroughs, the innovation, the dexterity that we need to really think about scaling up a new industry. And a little bit more about the Carbon Business Council. The coalition is technology neutral. So our membership represents a range of pathways. When we talk about carbon removal, there's not a singular way to get carbon removal out of the atmosphere. There's a lot of different ways. And so part of the secret sauce of the Carbon Business Council, what gels us together, is bringing together a lot of different innovators who might have a disparate range of approaches, but we're really unified in this idea of trying to reverse the impacts of climate change and work on scaling up a new industry responsibly.
Is it fair to say it's like a trade association, and it's can you tell us a bit more about, like, does it lobby?
Yes. So the Carbon Business Council is a trade association. We represent the companies who are working in carbon removal, and we have a couple of different pillars and vertical areas. One is on the policy front, like you just said, where we work with companies to develop and form cohesive policies and work on advocating for those policies. So we'll do that through member-driven working groups where we'll dive into policy issues. We'll respond to government requests for information to share the perspective of innovators in the space of what they see will create an enabling environment. One of our other verticals and focus areas is around advocating for the responsible growth of carbon removal. And I can dive a little bit more into that at some point while we're on. But really, as carbon removal is scaling, we're asking the question, how do we maximize benefits for local communities? And so we have our CDR RDT initiative, which I can talk through. We work on educating stakeholders and the general public about carbon removal. So I have a couple of different verticals, but broadly speaking, we're focused on creating an enabling environment to reach gigaton scale removals.
That's fantastic, Ben. And I think it was funny to hear you say that not only is carbon removal a silver bullet for climate change generally, but that even within your own arsenal, there's not a particular silver bullet. It's kind of a myriad of solutions that you're pursuing kind of within your own role. I think I might want to pose the next question, which I will admit is pretty meaty. We've got a couple that will follow on to this, but we touched on this in the introduction. There is some debate in the scientific community about how exactly we should leverage carbon removal as a climate change strategy. Some believe that we should focus our efforts solely on the reduction side of things. So in your role with your experience, any thoughts on how we can balance carbon emissions reduction with carbon removal?
I think scientists themselves have aligned and coalesced around the fact that there is a need for carbon removal, but though that's in that UN report that I mentioned, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has appeared in multiple reports since that 2018 study, the National Academy of Sciences. Scientists are reaching similar conclusions, but these scientific reports are certainly not saying that carbon removal is a substitute for the important work of reducing emissions. It becomes a both and so if we're thinking about something like a net zero climate commitment to be net zero by 2030 or to be net zero by 2050, the idea is in achieving that net zero pledge, a large part of that is predicated on reducing emissions as much as possible. But you might have some portion of emissions that are hard to abate. And that's where you can have carbon removal introduced as a way to balance out to zero. There is an opportunity to go even further and support even more transformative, ambitious carbon removal action, which is the idea of not only having a net zero pledge, but to actually have a net negative pledge, to go net negative. A corporation like Microsoft has done this, where they've pledged to remove, not only to balance out to zero, but to actually remove the CO2 that they put into the atmosphere over the lifespan of a company. So it's different ways to think about it. I think this net negative example is great because it's a way of showing that carbon removal can actually raise the bar, raise the ambition on climate action, rather than being a substitute for that crucial work of reducing emissions.
I love the way you phrased that, Ben, and I want to circle back to a point you mentioned a couple minutes ago about this responsibility idea. So the question is, how do we ensure that carbon removal is deployed responsibly, and how can removals be deployed so that they earn effectively the social license to operate in communities?
One stat that I think is really important for folks to keep in mind in both the climate tech space in general and carbon removal space is there's an article that came out in Science Direct, a study about renewable energy projects. And the study showed that in research that only 13% of renewable energy projects that were studied that faced local opposition were completed once they faced an initial stoppage or delay. If communities end up having concerns about a climate tech project, be it solar farm, renewable wind project, or a carbon removal project, if those questions go unanswered, if there's not two-way community dialogue, then it becomes harder to deploy carbon removal. But there's also another way to think about that, which is for project developers to begin thinking, how do I earn the social license to operate? And as I'm thinking about project deployment, how do I maximize benefits in a local community? How do I minimize the risks? How do I have a two-way dialogue with the community? And with these kinds of questions in mind, the Carbon Business Council work last year, we released an initiative called the Carbon Dioxide Removal Responsible Deployment Training. It's an introductory online training and a set of tools and resources for companies to walk through questions exactly like this, to start thinking through how to begin community engagement. How do I have a two-way dialogue? This work is critically important, and it's also complicated. But like I said, the training itself is introductory. It's a beginning and not an end. But we do think for carbon removal to reach this gigaton scale, that the social license aspect of it is going to be critically important.
All right, so Ben, one of the things we talked about in our intro was the potential environmental impact of certain kinds of carbon removal. We talked about for direct air capture, capturing 1 million tons of CO2 could take up to over 400,000 square feet of land. 50 tons of water could be used for each ton of CO2 captured with DAC. So could you touch on maybe putting a more context around water use, energy use, land use with any form of carbon removal you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think if we're zooming out and thinking about a portfolio approach, relying on multiple pathways will help reduce concerns that any one pathway might have. When we start to extrapolate out, okay, what does it mean if we have gigatons of carbon removal? If we get there alone with any one pathway, we might see concerns start to appear of, okay, well, this might require a lot of land area, or this might require a high baseload of power. But when we start to introduce in other forms of carbon removal that don't necessarily have those concerns, that's what starts to bring us, I think, a balanced approach to scaling things up.
Got it. Okay, so I want to go back to, you mentioned Microsoft, where they have this negative carbon goal. And my understanding is that you suggest that companies have like these twin climate targets, like we want to reduce our emissions by this amount, and we want to remove this amount of carbon emissions. So I don't know if I've seen companies very explicitly say, here's our carbon reduction goal and here's our carbon removal goal. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. And you summed it up exactly, the concept of a twin target. And I think this goes back to an earlier question you both asked around how does carbon removal work in tandem with reducing emissions. Twin targets offer a pathway forward where you just start to give more specificity of we will remove this amount and we will work to remove this amount. The carbon removal community stands behind this idea of twin targets. There's an open letter that's circulated that more than 100 organizations and companies, including the Carbon Business Council, have signed on to, making a call for twin targets. We are starting to see twin targets increasingly appear in government policy. The California Air Resources Board is an example, and a scoping plan laid out here's how much we plan to reduce emissions to reach California's climate goals. Here's how much we plan to remove emissions. European Union policy has set about something similar with a target by 2040. So there are examples of this taking place. I think increasingly we'll likely see this appearing in more corporate net zero pledges. It brings more certainty to the market for carbon removal to really specify how much we're talking about, how big the market size is when we're talking about carbon removal. And I think it brings increased transparency to net zero pledges. The Standards-Based Targets Initiative has suggested as one framework for companies to aim for about 90% reducing emissions and 10% removals is one just example of a number to put out, but that's going to vary by industry. That's going to vary by particular needs, but just to help contextualize how much we're talking about reductions and how much we're talking about removals.
Yeah, no, it definitely sounds like something to watch. Like I say, I haven't seen a corporate. I appreciate those government examples, so it'll be interesting to see who are the first movers on that.
Agreed.
And Ben, I realize that this is perhaps like asking a parent to pick their favorite child, but I'm going to do it anyways. Is there, at least in this particular moment, a particular solution that gets you most jazzed as we're talking this morning?
As a representative for a trade association that's been built on tech neutrality, really, I'm excited about the multitude of them. I think when we go down the road of saying, here's the one pathway that's going to get us to gigatons of carbon removed, all of these various pathways are promising, but I think it's really the sum total where we start to have the most impact and that benefit of trying to bring them all along. And I think in that context, for anyone who's not so familiar with carbon removal, it's great for folks to check out all of these different pathways, everything from direct air capture to the enhanced weathering we've been talking about, to bike rides. It really spans the gamut, and it's great to read up on all these pathways.
Okay, so it sounds like there's no silver bullet of carbon removal technology either. But at the same time, you've, I think, talked about how you guys want to enable gigatons worth of carbon removal. So what's standing in your way? Are there policies, financing that you need to scale that you don't have yet?
Yeah, I think this is where we benefit from an ecosystem approach to it. So some of the policies and the private sector, they interplay off of each other. We benefit from increased private sector investment in the space, and that's happening. That's been boosted and galvanized by the fact that we are fortunate to benefit from several policies that help support carbon removal. Right now in the US, the federal government supports RD&D for carbon removal, their support for research, their support for development, their support for deployment. We're seeing this with the Direct Air Capture Hubs program. There's some really exciting policies that exist in the US right now. The US Department of Energy, on the demand side to help incentivize the market, has a funding opportunity recently closed for $35 million for the federal government to procure carbon removal. It's a relatively modest amount of funding at this point, but I think a really exciting program that the government can help build demand for the market. The U.S. Department of Energy recently also put out $100 million for pilots on carbon removal. Similar to the Carbon Business Council's approach, we were encouraged to see that largely takes a tech neutral pathway. And so when we're thinking about carbon removal, we're thinking through how do we build the market? What does that mean on the public sector side and the private sector side? And our red threads, the questions we're looking at throughout it is, how do we ensure this responsible deployment, and how do we ensure a level playing field so that multiple forms of carbon removal can scale up? But I think some of these recent examples are definitely promising ones that point to the enabling policies that we're seeing.
Is there anything on like permitting at a local level?
Permitting is definitely a big part of the conversation right now. I think because there's a range of carbon removal pathways, the permitting conversation looks different for different permitting. And so one example of how the permitting conversation is playing out is the US EPA regulates permits for underground geologic storage of CO2, which is tied to direct air capture. So these are Class 6 permits. There's conversations taking place right now on the permitting front where states are asking for primacy, for states to actually be the permitting authority instead of the EPA. And we've seen states be granted primacy of Class 6 permitting. And so will certain states, the permits for that might be at the federal level, other states it might be at the state level. And permitting is ongoing. For the permitting conversations are ongoing for some of the emergent forms of carbon removal. The US EPA also recently put out some permitting guidance for marine-based carbon removal. There's a RFI that's recently opened up for that, for folks to look at that and respond for what that looks like. And so the permitting frameworks are an active conversation.
And that's a request for information.
A request for information, yes.
Just for those that don't know, RFI.
Yes, there can be, with RFIs, there can definitely be acronym soup in policy making. But yeah, so with that example of this RFI that went out, it's an example of how these issues are being actively worked out as we speak.
Yeah, so interesting. I feel like a lot of these examples are US focused. Are there any other countries elsewhere that have actually started really looking at this and diving in and taking the lead?
I think as far as global call-outs, a couple of examples that I could get into.
Yeah.
One is, I think it's really interesting to see how countries are working together. So the US has initiated the Carbon Management Challenge, which is a forum for countries to sign on to and work together in the challenge. Several countries have signed up to that. New signatories were announced at COP, and it's great to try and see cohesion in policies between different countries. At COP28, a new effort launched called the Group of Negative Emitters, which is a group of 3 countries to start that will hopefully expand to more of countries pledging to become net negative.
And just to be clear, Ben, with net negative, you can't be negative without removal, correct?
I think that's where carbon removal comes in. To get to negative, even if you stop reducing emissions, you would need some amount of carbon removal to get to net negativity. Yes.
So this negative, what was it called? The Negative Emitters Group?
The Group of Negative Emitters.
So close.
Group of Negative Emitters. So they're basically, almost by definition, have to be pro-removal or willing to engage on removal. Is that right?
That's it. Yeah.
Okay.
And so it's an example of countries working together on both a declaration of countries thinking about carbon removal, but also in turn, because emissions reductions is an important part of it too. It becomes a both end, but yes, that's it. And I think with those 3 countries or this carbon management challenge, just great examples of collaboration across countries and some really interesting carbon removal deployment happening in the global south. Different geologic conditions or weather conditions, climate conditions can make different countries really natural fits for carbon removal deployment. There's a lot of really interesting deployment opportunities happening right now in Kenya, where the Great Rift Carbon Valley in Kenya, which has geothermal energy, makes it a really good fit to power direct air capture. So carbon removal is global in nature. Carbon removal is happening around the world.
Excellent. Well, then, speaking of growing, you also referenced this idea of job opportunities. We would expect that there is a big potential job market for roles in this space. Is there any kind of advice that you would give to those interested in learning more or getting a role in carbon removal?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time to dive into the space. There are all kinds of opportunities for all different kinds of skills. And so whether someone wants to be a part of a startup working on this or be part of an NGO that's working through policy, there is just a host of opportunities out there. And I do think it's a really exciting time to jump in. The Carbon Business Council is going to be hiring, so keep an eye out for our careers page if people want to join us. There's a lot of great job boards out there that help track this stuff. ClimateBase is one example where they post different jobs and you can filter by category and look through and see what exists out there in the carbon removal space. And there is definitely a host of job postings. And so I do think whatever role or skill set someone might have, it can be welcomed into the carbon removal world if anyone wanted to contribute their talent and expertise.
And what was the name of the job database you said you could search by type of role?
That's called climate based. And that's, it's a good one to just keep an eye on different jobs in the space and knowing how to enter the market. There's some other job boards out there. I can send a couple more over if you want to drop in any links for the show notes. But climate based is one that comes to mind.
Climate based. Jay, I hadn't heard of that one. Have you?
No, it's funny, Scott. I feel like, both you and I are pretty familiar with these boards between GreenBiz and whatever else. Yeah. But no, it's always great to add another tool to the toolbox. So thanks.
And then, Ben, for those that are like, okay, carbon removal, I learned a lot in this episode, but I want to learn more. What would you recommend? I mean, I understand that Carbon Business Council has this biweekly newsletter, Carbon Fix. I guess people could sign up for that, right? I mean, what resources would you point people to?
Yeah, I think the Carbon Fix is a great compilation for ways to just keep a pulse on the news and see what's happening. We highlight innovator highlights, so it's a way to track the startups who are raising new capital, expanding in the space. We track policy, so it's a good way to see what's going on there. There's events, there's meetups, and so I think that newsletter that's free, that's a community resource. I think that's a great way to keep tabs on things. I think for folks who are interested in this responsible deployment aspect of carbon removal, the CDR RDT is also a great resource. We've got more than 200 resources compiled there of different resources. And so deep diving into that, no shortage of reading content. We put out issue briefs on different topics. We recently published one on marine carbon removal. And so for folks who want to learn more about what that is and what's happening for carbon removal in the ocean, that's a great resource. We'll have another issue brief coming out soon on enhanced weathering. So definitely no shortage of resources to dive into within the Carbon Business Council, but there is a host of a ton of great resources out there. I think participating in events can be good. We're planning a symposium in Seattle this April. So for folks who want to just attend and be a part of conversations in person and hear from companies and hear from policymakers, that's great. San Francisco Climate Week is great in April, where there's going to be events. New York Climate Week is great in September. So I'd say, for whatever kind of learner you are, whether you want to be in person and hear it or you want to read up and see it, there are definitely resources. There are ways to get engaged and learn about it.
And what did you say, CDRRT? I think you might have said it earlier in the episode, but just to refresh my memory and maybe some of the listeners, what does that stand for again?
Yes, and I appreciate you catching my acronyms to help make this as accessible as possible. So the CDR-RDT is our shorthand for the Carbon Dioxide Removal Responsible Deployment Training, which is available on the Carbon Business Council website.
Okay, cool.
All right, Ben. Well, this is going to bring us to our last and perhaps most infamous question that we ask on this show, which is our party fact question. So here's the scenario. Let's say we're at some kind of party where there's a great spread, great drinks, all kinds of tasty different biochar options for folks. And we're chatting casually, and let's say the topic of carbon removal comes up, and we want to arm our listeners with one party fact that they could use to convey exactly how important carbon removal is. So we ask you, Ben, what might that quantitative party fact be?
Great question. Love party facts. There's so many different stats out there in the carbon removal space. I think one that comes to mind for me is just trying to visualize what we're talking about when we're talking about a gigaton of carbon removal. It can sound vague and esoteric, and what does it mean? How do we visualize it? And so just, I guess, to break that down or try and turn this into a bite-sized party fact, 1 gigaton is equal to 1 billion metric tons. And if we think about that too, 1 billion metric tons, that is such a big number. It's really hard to break down and quantify. That is about the equivalent mass of 10,000 fully loaded U.S. aircraft carriers. So if we're thinking about 10,000 planes that are fully loaded, and we think about that weight, the plane and the weight inside the plane, we think about that 10,000, and then we start extrapolating that, we multiply that. It just starts to give us a sense of the scale of how much carbon removal we're talking about when we're talking about marine carbon removal or biomass burial and storage or direct air capture, just to give a sense of how much CO2 we're talking about getting out of the atmosphere. There is a lot of work to be done. And so definitely appreciated your questions about the job opportunities, because I think we need all hands on deck of people diving into the space and putting their talent in it.
Thanks for those additional resources. Thank you again for sharing your time, your insights, and I think people need to follow the Carbon Fix and keep an eye on the space, because, man, this is so critical to our climate change goals.
Thank you so much, Jay and Scott, for having me on. It was great to connect with you both today.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. Look forward to following along. All right, Scott, as this episode comes to a close, we've been talking about carb fixes. I got to go get my snack fix. So I think it's time we wrap this puppy up.
What are you eating?
Anna just got a dangerous new bag. Do you ever have those, I think they're called popcorners, like the kettle corn?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Kind? Oh, my God. I could tackle a bag of those in one sitting.
But I feel like as far as snacks go, I could think of a lot worse things.
Yeah, well, I made a point not to mention the Doritos that are also in my pantry.
Fair enough. I feel like Anna is kind of the source of all your junk food.
I don't know if she would disagree with that, Scott.
That was diplomatically put.
Thank you. I think my cookie intake has definitely increased since we've been together.
Fair enough.
All right. So as we wrap up, we want to thank our usual round of folks. Taylor Price for another outstanding set of intro notes. Keaton Butler for another fantastic job editing this piece of audio together.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks also to Square Peg, Round Hole, and Potions for the music we play in our episodes. And of course, folks, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And Jay, we have a review. You just sent this to me. I'm going to read it live. We're doing this live. All right.
Let's do it live.
This is from Sus Energy Teacher. It was left on February 20th, and the title is 2 thumbs up and a gold star. This is from a teacher, so of course there's a gold star, Jay.
Oh, yes.
Okay. She then wrote here, when I was hired to be a sustainable energy lab teacher for grades K through 5, I had no clue how I was going to break down sustainability and renewable energy sources for an elementary school crowd. While I respected the planet and tried to do as much as I could to reduce my carbon footprint, I had no, quote, earthly, I love it, idea how to begin my journey towards educating our future leaders. That's where your podcast comes into play. Trust me when I say I listen to a ton of sustainability content, but none of them resonated with me like your podcast and the amazingly wonderful jokes.
Whoa.
With each episode, I felt like I had a better grip on what I needed to teach and incorporate into my curriculum. Now, over halfway through the school year, I listen to your podcast every morning on my way to work.
Oh my goodness.
Not only can I impress my students with party facts and tidbits about sustainability, but I've developed an engaging curriculum around many of the topics featured on your show. Thank you for creating an interesting, funny, and entertaining way to learn about helping our planet and embracing a sustainable mindset. If I was your sustainable energy teacher, I would give you 2 thumbs up and a gold star. Sus energy teacher. Oh my goodness, this is so nice. Whoever this is, you need to email us, okay? Hosts, HOSTS at sustainabilitydefined.com, because we want to say thank you. But also we have an education portion of our website, and maybe if you haven't seen that, you can use it, but also maybe we can add some of how you're using the show to that.
And honestly, please reach out. We got a bunch of stickers we can send your way to you and your kids. I mean, that sounds
amazing.
I
love it.
And yeah. Scott, I mean, this review, I was listening to it live. I mean, this is what it's all about, right? Like, I think
totally.
This is the stuff that really gets us moving. And Sus Energy Teacher, thanks for sharing the story.
Yes, this is totally the pickup we needed. And I'll say, Jay, that we still have our donation match going as well for Uproot Project.
That's right.
And so some of you, I hope, listened on the last episode. We interviewed the lead for the Uproot Project, which is this network of environmental journalists of color. They're there to support them. And so we've got this donation match going up to $500. I think we've only gotten $50 worth of donations so far, Jay. Is that right?
I think that's right. We're still waiting for more.
No, we want to fully use this match. So please, if you haven't yet, check out the episode, go to Uproot Project, donate what you can, send us the receipt. That's again to HOSTS, hosts at sustainabilitydefined.com, and then we'll get it matched.
Fantastic.
All right, Jay, I think that about does it. You all stay sustainable out there. I'm Scott Breen.
And I'm Jay Siegel. We will see you next time.